Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. Welcome to the show. Income inequality, while affecting many before the financial crisis of 2008, has steadily made its way into the national conversation as the economy has continued to stall. Yet within these national conversations, such as they are, class is rarely discussed and is even harder to define. The USA, since its founding in many ways, has operated under a narrative of a classless society, except from time to time when social movements have forced a shift. This happened most recently when the Occupy movement broached the topic with the notion of the 1 versus the 99%. Well, so far so good, many said and still say, but within that 99%, not everyone comes from the same economic experience. And according to our next guest, as long as class is hard to acknowledge in activist spaces, it's going to be hard to build united movements. Betsy Leondar-Wright is the program director at Class Action and is the author of the book Missing Class: Strengthening Social Movement Groups by Seeing Class Cultures. Betsy, welcome to the program. Glad to have you.
Great to be with you, Laura.
So Betsy, let's start where you start, with culture. What do you mean cultures?
By class cultures, I mean different ways of talking, different ways of approaching problems. All of us are formed by our class background, our class life experience, to just approach situations differently. And we have different knowledge base and different networks. And those mean we have really different gifts.
Your book is really a study. You look at 25 groups, and then you end up focusing, I think, on 4, 5.
You're talking about 25 organizations that we went to their meetings and observed them and then interviewed them and got their class backgrounds and everything. And so then I clumped the activists that I met. They're from 5 states, all different progressive issues, everything left of center. And I then took like all the people who, their parents didn't go to college and were working class and they didn't go to college. So I compared all the working class people from all the groups with all the professional middle class people from all the groups, with all the voluntarily downwardly mobile people and all the upwardly mobile straddlers. And so I did that 4-way class comparison and found that almost everything I tested for, there were class culture differences.
So how do you do those tests?
It's the magic of statistics. So you can look for anything, like types of humor, for example, or types of speech. And you can say, well, how often does this type of humor occur from activists of this class background versus this? And then how likely is it that that happened by chance? So I got help from a lot of very expert social scientists to figure that out. And some things are more vary by gender or by race, but we're more familiar with those cultural differences. If you say, oh yeah, when there's a conflict, the women were playing one role and the men were playing another. Like a lot of activists are very good at naming a gender dynamic or a race dynamic. We're terrible at naming a class dynamic.
So a class dynamic, I'm completely guessing, but I'm imagining some classes of people are more accustomed to be snide or sarcastic than others. A certain kind of sarcasm, it seems to me, is often kind of class typed. You could say that's a kind of just amusing thing.
Right.
But you're saying this has real implications for our ability to organize and make change.
That's right. It really does, because movements, social justice groups depend on voluntary energy. It has to be an inherently enjoyable experience. Yeah. You have to enjoy the other people. And if your senses of humor are clashing, or you disagree on how much inward focus should there be versus outward focus or on group process. I think that that's some of what's going on, is that like is clumping with like.
And other people are feeling hurt or put off when nobody actually had that intention.
Right, exactly.
You've been working on this for a long time. How did this first occur to you in your own life, perhaps, your work?
Well, I've been an activist for over 30 years, in a lot of different movements, seen a lot of attempts at cross-class groups and cross-race groups, and a lot of coalitions that lasted a short time or a longer time. And I just started noticing over and over again that coalitions were breaking along class lines. So like in the globalization movement, after Seattle 99, when so many of us came together and marched as Teamsters and Turtles, the labor movement kind of went off with one strategy, and the environmentalists and the student groups went off with a different strategy.
And you think that had to do with class?
I do. And with movement tradition, it's not just our own individual class culture, but what we've inherited from the progressive people who've come before us.
Like what?
The most distinct subculture of activists in the U.S. today is the young anarchists, who have were influenced by a lot of the direct action movements and are carrying traditions created in the globalization movement, and just ways of doing things that they're not thinking of as having anything to do with the fact that in my study they're actually from the most elite class backgrounds.
Which would correspond with their willingness to risk arrest, things like that? That they push a confrontational approach with enforcement authorities that perhaps people of a different class or a different immigration status might not risk?
Certainly there are people who need to be very cautious and for whom it's much more serious to get in trouble with the cops. I actually discovered when I was looking to see what is and isn't a class culture trait, militance and being moderate, those are not class traits. But there are more radical people and more moderate people in every movement tradition, every class of activists. So I don't think it's that, but I think, for example, the taste for the aversion to leadership, that leadership is a bad word, and the preference for very horizontal egalitarian preference actually comes from a long tradition of college-educated people. As one working class blogger said, middle-class people think that if someone else is in charge, it's a crisis. So I don't know if that's maybe an overstatement, but so that's like an example of something where people are missing class, that tastes in, lifestyle, clothing, vegan food, group consensus process, are not seen as class-specific tastes. In fact, they're seen as part of people rejecting class privilege. But when anarchist groups or other people from college-educated backgrounds try to work with community organizing groups or unions, they often find that those are the points of conflict.
In your research, what were some of the questions that you asked the groups that you studied as you tried to kind of tease out their class consciousness?
Well, after we observed the meetings, we would interview members of the group. And one thing we would ask is, how are people in your group similar and how are they different from each other? And we were doing that to see what identities, if any, people would mention. And sometimes they would just mention their differences of opinion. Gender was the most common identity mentioned, how many men and how many women. Pretty often the racial composition got mentioned. Class almost never, literally, almost no one mentioned the class diversity or lack thereof in the group. And so then we would prompt them, well, what is the class composition of the group? We started out with the written questions saying social class and discovered that many people do not know that term and literally didn't know what we were asking about. So we'd say, the class composition, like who's richer, who's poorer, who has more education and less. And so then people would answer, they would guess, because they almost never had talked about their class backgrounds or their class life stories in the group. And so in the majority of cases, they guessed wrong about at least somebody. Often they were answering about race, presuming that the people of color were the working class and poor people, even though there were some upper middle class African Americans, for example, and presuming that the white people were middle class, even though there were some lifelong working class or poor white people. So sometimes they would answer with race, sometimes they would answer in a resistant way, like, oh, I hate dividing people like that, or I hate talking about, about class. I think we're all equal, we should all be equal. Sometimes they would just be this long, garbled thing or no answer at all.
And when they did advance an analysis, were they right?
No, and often they were guessing wrong about who was in their group. So what because I Class Action has these workshops where we make a safe space for people to reveal things about their class background. Just about any group of people has class secrets in it. There's people hiding privileges and there's people hiding hardships. So Class Action, we give people opportunities to share their class life stories. So that's what I say is you don't have to do a big social science research study until, I've been doing it for 7 years. You don't have to take 7 years of your life and get people to fill out surveys and do statistics. You can just make a confidential space and take some time and draw out people's stories and find out who's who.
Now, there's a lot of people with privilege who feel very guilty about it.
Right.
Have you figured out what gifts you bring as a more privileged person, and are you able yet to feel proud about them and talk about those too?
Guilt can be kind of an immobilizing emotion unless you've actually done something harmful, and then you should rectify it. Yeah, I am proud of what I bring from my class background. I think I grew up with a lot of confidence and a sense like that I could make a difference. I could make things happen. I could, you can do anything you want. You can do it. And then I had a really great education where, among other things, I learned history of social movements. But what I learned, and I learned this the hard way from working in coalitions and being a community organizer, if you bring those gifts of confidence and knowledge of big frames in history and theory, if you bring those gifts in arrogantly, they're useless. Yeah. Nobody wants them. To solve a social problem, you have to hear from the people directly affected by that social problem. And that's the most important kind of knowledge. And so there are perspectives that are only seen by working class and poor people that are absolutely essential to crafting solutions. And so it has to be like, humbly, well, here's some confidence I have, here's some contacts and people I know I could contact on behalf of our cause, but I want to learn what what your life experience has taught you, and maybe if we put what we know together, then together we can make some social change.
We're celebrating this year the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer in Mississippi, an organizing initiative that famously brought mostly pretty well-to-do college kids, some of them, not all of them white, but a class group of people down to the South, Mississippi and Alabama, and had them work in and live in very working class, almost exclusively African-American communities. How were the class dynamics played out there? My impression is they were really talked about.
Well, they were talked about as race differences for sure, and there was fallout from that summer that led to SNCC becoming an all-black group. So the sense of these white interlopers seemed like they're kind of know-it-alls. There were definitely race tensions. There were a lot of gender tensions. So this is some of how the birth of the second wave feminist movement was all these women that had experience in either the civil rights or anti-war movement who were like, there is as much sexism inside the movement as there is outside. There was less talk about class, in part because the civil rights movement in the South was a mixed class movement. And it followed a pattern that we've seen in a lot of other movements as well, that the first people to stick their neck out and do these risky direct actions were actually the more class advantaged segments of the black community. So the clergy and the students. Think about who did the lunch counter sit-ins. It went from college to college to college to college. Starting with Greensboro, and the clergy, they were just people in less danger of being lynched. And of course, when there did start to be leadership from the low-income people like Fannie Lou Hamer, people who were sharecroppers and domestic workers and so forth, that was very celebrated, and spotlight was shown on that because that was very exciting. And I think that people who had a little more job security or weren't as vulnerable sort of cleared that space. And so that's an example of how there can be a cross-class alliance of like using relative class privilege to make possible a cross-class movement. I think it's one of the most mixed class movements we've ever had in this country, and that's why it was the one that won the most social change.
So what are the lessons we need to learn?
Well, we need to start seeing the actual class compositions of our social justice groups without any pretense and posing and fake poor people, noticing who's there, who's not there, not hiding privilege, not hiding hardships, and so taking some honest stock and talking about who brings what gifts. And getting exposed to other movement traditions and how they do things, how they solve problems, and adding tools to we all can add tools to our toolkit. And it's not that you should go and pretend to be a class, different than yourself, but just recognizing, oh, right now the way I'm talking, very influenced by the fact that I'm third generation to go to college. And I've learned from these wonderful working class and poor activists how to talk in a more colorful and lively way, telling stories and using metaphors. Maybe I'll be better at persuading people to my cause.
Now, that's not the same as talking down.
No, it's not. And right, you never want to do that terrible thing, which I'm sure you also heard people do in prior decades of dropping your G's and trying to...
There's the accent change, but then there's also okay, I now have to speak in only words of 2 syllables because heaven forbid anybody of a different class would be able to, might get confused.
No, actually, I discovered these really big speech differences in percentage of concrete versus abstract words, per 10,000 words of speech. The way that working class and poor activists speak, with more stories, more first person, more emotion, more metaphors and colorful language, is better persuasive.
The way we would all be better off speaking.
Yes, no matter who you're trying to convince, you should include that. But that doesn't mean you do it to the exclusion. No matter who you're talking with, it's good to use abstract general words when they carry a lot of vision.
So we can still say patriarchy, capitalism, and hegemony.
Maybe not all in the same sentence. Pick one, define it, give an example, tell what it means to you. So an example of an organization that exists partly to push an unknown piece of jargon, my organization, Class Action, we are trying to make classism and classist a household word. So we say those a lot, even though people don't know them, even though they are, abstract generalizations, but we try to illustrate them with lots of stories and examples and fervor. And
is there anyone else out there that you see doing this work really well?
Yes, I think there are a lot of great cross-class alliances. I would hold up the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and the way that a lot of upper middle class faith communities backed the tomato pickers, and how when they do tours, they have students hosting them and unions hosting them, and they have actually won raises for tomato pickers. So I'd say that's a really great story of a cross-class alliance.
Finally, Betsy, back to you. How are you going to be using this book, and how can people use it in their work that they're doing?
Yeah, I'm hoping it's a really practical book. I tell a lot of stories in it, but also make generalizations and put forward a vision of a cross-class movement. So I'm hoping to inspire a lot of conversations. This is what Class Action does in our workshops, is we get people sharing their class life stories and what strengths we took from them. So I'm hoping to spark a lot more of those conversations. I'm hoping to I've created interactive workshops based on the book, and I'm going around the country doing those with other Class Action workshop facilitators. But I'm also hoping to make more online tools and do-it-yourself kits and things to start those conversations, to look at our groups and our group dynamics and at ourselves and our other activists through a lens of class cultures.
Betsy Leondar-Wright, thank you so much for coming in and telling us about your new book. I appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm so happy to be here.
Keep up the great work.
Thank you.